Uh, David, you want to start out with your poem, maybe, while we're waiting?
Well, it's a very short poem. I could do that. And this is the poem today is from John Keats. It's from his famous Bright Star sonnet. Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. My apologies for being late. The computer wanted to stay sleeping.
Understand.
Okay, here's the poem for the morning. Bright star, were I as steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart. And I imagine that Keats was looking at the North Star when he wrote that poem. Thank you.
Thank you, David. How's everyone?
Good.
Steve, I just got your message as I logged in. Am I hearable, seeable?
Yep.
No, I can hear you.
You're
Okay.
good.
All right, great. Thank you. Ooh. All right, okay. Because some seeable doesn't mean that I can see well, but this is crazy to my empathies and sympathies to all who are struggling with the allergies like I am. Anyway, we continue in the book of Vayikra of Leviticus. We only actually have 3 portions to look at today, from 2 weeks ago, from last week, and then from this coming week. And the reason for that is, if you will remember, Pesach, Passover, first Seder was Friday night, and then the last night in the traditional calendar was also Friday night into Saturday morning. And when that happens, different communities either choose to read the assigned Passover portions and divide that into, historically, on the last day of Passover, we read the Song of the Sea, which is what the Saturday morning Torah study people were just dealing with the last week or two, because the traditionally understood that's the exact anniversary of crossing the Sea of Reeds, is on the last day of Passover. Other communities will start to move on ahead. If they've concluded Pesach, then they'll start to move ahead. So they would have read Acharei Mot and then into Kadoshim, and then they'll be a week ahead of everyone else until next week. So for approximately 3 weeks, they would be ahead of everyone else. And then they would double up the portions next week so that everyone would get back onto the same calendar by the time, or the cyclical reading of the calendar, in the calendar by the time we begin Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. Still, other communities, primarily the Reform Reconstructionist and North American community, chooses, and they alternate whenever this happens. They kind of alternate between reading Acharei Mot twice over 2 weeks, or reading Kadoshim in advance over 2 weeks. This year was the year that it would be assigned that we were reading Acharei Mot twice. So that's a long explanation of why we only have the 3 parshiot, the 3 portions, for a month's worth of discussions. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to begin with Acharei Mot, with a summary. It will not take me 2 weeks to do so, but I'll do Acharei Mot. Professor David is going to accept the challenge of summarizing and leading us through probably the most famous of the Torah portions. Certainly, the ancient rabbis felt that it was the most important, and indeed, it falls right in the middle of an open Torah scroll. If you should open it up and start counting the columns in one direction or the other, you'll find that this portion is right in the middle. And then we'll come back to this week's portion, which is known as Emor, and we'll focus on that as well. So, Acharei Mot, which comes to us right after the portions that we read and we studied about leprosy and about the role of the priests as a healer and as a welcomer back into the community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's called Acharei Mot only because there's a brief reference to the tragedy which we encountered closer to the beginning of the book of Leviticus, of the deaths of Nadab and Avihu, two of the four sons of Aaron the high priest. If you remember that at the end, on the 8th day, at the end of the extended celebration of ordination of Aaron and his sons as priests, Nadab and Avihu, according to the text, took alien fire, they offered sacrifices not in the prescribed manner, and although there are lots of interpretations of that, but they were tragically killed on the spot. They were struck by lightning, or the sacrificial fire consumed them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we spoke about it. And I teach about it frequently, using it as a paradigm for understanding the different commentaries. And someday, God willing, there may even be a book coming out of that. We'll see. Anyway, so the portion is called Acharei Mot, after the death of Nadav and Avihu, but they mean it in the narrative sense. We're now continuing back in the story of what happens to the children of Israel as they continue in their wandering. God tells Moses to speak to Aaron and tell him that he alone is to participate in a ceremony that will be referred to over the next 3 weeks. That he alone should be the one, the high priest should be the one and the only one who is permitted to enter the Holy of Holies, the very center part of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And then, of course, in the temple in Jerusalem, it is only the high priest who enters, and that's on Yom Kippur, which is a ritual that we'll be talking about a little bit later. For that ceremony, for that ritual, the high priest is to wear special clothes, special vestments. There's one commentary that kind of not flippantly, but seriously says, because it's possible that the clothes that Nadav and Avihu wore were flammable. So we have to make sure that the high priest, when he comes close to the fire, is not wearing flammable clothes. So there were different descriptions. I'm not sure if that actually works out scientifically, rather than just cosmetically, for the high priest to be identified wearing different clothes than the others. He is to offer the sin offering again, and this is before we're told about Yom Kippur specifically, the Day of Atonement as the specific day. But when the high priest does enter, when Aaron or his successors, when they enter the Holy of Holies, they give a sin offering that consisted of a bull and of 2 he-goats. I don't know if there's a more technical term for he-goats. My translation said he-goats. One of those he-goats is assigned to be slaughtered for God, and the other is assigned for, and the word in Hebrew is Azazel, which we're not really sure. It was an accepted term at the time. We're not really sure if it was a term that referred to something or a particular ceremony or ritual or behavior. We're not sure if it was a place. There are theories going each way, but the he-goat that was assigned for the sins of the people becomes known in both in biblical literature as well as literature throughout the ages as the scapegoat. That's the goat on which all of the sins, all of the mistakes, all of the transgressions, it's all of the guilt of the people was placed on the one of these two goats that the high priest was to designate. The bull and one of the goats, the goat for God, if you will, were to be slaughtered. Then the Azazel goat, the scapegoat, Aaron was to put his hands on the goat to confess. And there's again the wording will be familiar. I'm not going to go through it all now, but it's familiar because it's in the Yom Kippur afternoon ritual and liturgy that the Aaron puts his hands on this scapegoat, the Azazel goat, and confesses his sins, the sins of his family, and the sins of all the people of Israel. It's repeated 3 times, and then the goat is sent off, is freed, is sent off to carry away all the sins and all the transgressions out into the wilderness. That's in the wilderness experience with the tabernacle. Once there's the Holy of Holies, you might know, and again, if you've been to Jerusalem, you can picture it. There's what's called the Gei Hinnom, which is the valley that's outside the walls to the south of the walls, the old walls of Jerusalem. And the goat was then thrown over the walls down into Gei Hinnom, Gehenna. Sometimes it's referred to in English, but the Hebrew is Gei Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. That was the junk pile. That's where all the garbage was thrown. The goat probably was very happy, but the people indeed saw that as a punishment and as a release from their sins. With this ritual in mind, then, the children of Israel are commanded to observe a day of Yom Kippur, the day of fasting, of self-denial, on which they are to seek forgiveness. And there will be many more details about that day ritual pattern in 2 weeks, but we're going to get it in an hour. Moses warns the people about offering sacrifices outside the designated ritual, again with an inference back to the Nadav and Avihu, who offered a sacrifice not according to the normal pattern, and hence that experience was understood as the Nadav and Avihu were punished for offering sacrifices not as ordained. The priests initially, but then it's extended to all the people, are not to drink the blood of any animal, nor to eat the flesh of any animal that has not been slaughtered humanely. Linking that to kashrut and the humane slaughtering of the animal. In other words, the example here specifically is talking about we're not to eat the meat or consume the blood of an animal that was killed by another animal, that was prey for some other animal. One side note here that again we'll be referring to in both the 2 portions to come is this word kadosh, the word that usually is translated as holy or sanctified. We certainly know it from kiddush, of the sanctifying the wine on Shabbat and on festivals. We know it from kaddish, affirming God's name and the sanctity of God and the sanctity of life. When we say mourners kaddish, kedusha, which is part of the worship service in the morning. But kadosh doesn't mean just holy in a what we would call sacred positive sense. Kadosh also means, in a sense, taboo, prohibited. Okay, so different, unique, special. And so you have to be very, very careful in how you approach something that is kadosh. And only certain people with certain roles to play can can approach or even touch that which is kadosh. So they actually use the word when they're talking about not drinking the blood of another animal, not consuming the flesh of an animal that has not been slaughtered. They actually include, because such and such may be kadosh. It may be, and in that sense, obviously not holy, but meaning prohibited, meaning taboo. So there are times when the high priest is considered taboo, is considered kadosh, and there are restrictions, as we will see, of how the high priest lives his life. And yes, it's only the his, because there were no female priests at that point, at least as referred to in the Torah this way. So you could not necessarily approach or interact with the high priest because he was kadosh. Yes, he was the holy, higher up in the hierarchy of the ritual and of the cultic practice, but it was forbidden. It was taboo to come too close and interrupt what he is doing, or to make him impure, which is again something that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Moses, finally, at the end of the portion, Moses condemns the sexual practices of the surrounding peoples that the Israelites are going to encounter, either as neighbors or as enemies. And they develop what's called in Hebrew and in rabbinic thinking, they develop taharat hamishpacha. It's actually Taharat. It's a Kamatz Katan, but Taharat HaMishpacha, of the purity of family life. It's almost like a euphemism that generally includes only wearing modest clothing, not showing any nakedness whatsoever, especially in times of I can't call it prayer, but in times of worship or avodah. Taharat hamishpacha, the purity of the family life, also prohibits sexual relations outside of marriage, or other prohibited sexual acts even within marriage. So there are some very specific statements that are made in the Torah, but then rabbinic literature later on, especially into codes like the Shulchan Aruch, really go into much more depth on this whole concept of family purity, and that which you do or don't do to maintain family purity, either as a man, as a woman, as a member of a family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the summary of Acharei Mot, the first of the three portions that we're going to look at. And I'm going to then hand this over to David, for as he and I banter about now for a couple of years. This is in each of our cases, it's our bar mitzvah Torah portion.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi. And I wanted to say before I begin that this will be a somewhat very personal summary of Kadoshian, because I believe that the Haftura was the one I read on April 29th, 1961, as my bar mitzvah. And Rabbi Norman read the Acharei Mot.
No, I did. We did Kadoshian on the
Okay.
Friday. It was Friday night service, but I did Kadoshian.
Yeah, but that was one of the years when the two were combined. And last year and next year, the two will be combined, but this year they're not. So they are done separately. here we are with Kadoshian. Kadoshian is Hebrew for the 14th word of the portion, holy ones. And as the rabbi explained, there are other definitions for Kadoshian. And just thinking of the title, and one of the things was that at the Shar Shemayim, they taught me the portion very well, but they taught me nothing about the meaning of it. And that didn't come until much, much later. So right about now. But anyway, I'm thinking that the word Kadoshian appears so often in the Saturday service. I do not know if it's directly related to this portion or not. But of course, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Kavod, V'lo kol ha'aretz kavodo is in the service just before the Shema. And then, of course, the third blessing in the Shemona Esrei, Ata Kadosh Hashem HaKadosh Hashem B'chol Yom Yalalucha Selah B'chata Hashem Ha'el HaKadosh. And because we're not actually praying this right now, but we are studying it, I'm using the, as I was taught back then at the Shar, to use the Ad Hashem Hebrew word signifying the name of the God. The reading is divided into 7 parts. Each one is called an aliyot. The first one is Leviticus 19, chapter 19, verse 1 to 14. And here, God is explaining to the Israelites how they can be holy because God is holy. And then he explained the holiness code, how people can be holy. And so God instructed the Israelites. And the first thing he instructs them in the first reading is to revere their mothers and fathers. This was one of the commandments that I never had a problem with because I was very, very close with both my parents. And when Wendy and I got together, I was just as close with her parents, and I just loved them, and I miss them beyond any possible measure right now. He instructed the Israelites to keep the Sabbath, never to turn to idols, to eat the sacrifice of the well-being, and not to reap all the way to the edges of a field, but to leave some for the poor and the stranger. You're not supposed to steal, to deceive, swear falsely, or defraud. To pay laborers their wages promptly, or never insult the deaf or impede the blind. The second aliyah, God continues the instruction to judge fairly, not to deal basely with their countrymen, to profit by their blood, or to hate them in their hearts. And this is very personal with me right now, for the simple reason, as I said, this is going to be very personal, that in our own family, I'm having a major difficulty with my younger brother, who has been accused of stealing and things like that. And it's very difficult for me, but he is still my brother. And he always will be my brother, and I can't abandon him. I absolutely cannot. And now we go on to the third reading. One of the things before we do that is to love others as oneself. And this particular commandment is repeated over and over again in the Torah, both in the Old Testament and in the Christian Greek scriptures, to love others as oneself. And might be getting to that a little bit again later. In the third meeting, we're supposed to regard the fruit of a newly planted tree as forbidden for 3 years, not to eat anything with its blood, not to practice divination or soothsaying, which we find out in Julius Caesar when the soothsayer comes up and he says to Caesar, beware the Ides of March. He is breaking one of the commandments by doing that, but he did it for good reason. And then they have instructions about shaving. And I think that if God were to come back and repeat the portion Kadoshian, there would probably be a commission to talk with him to see if that could be modernized a little bit, because a lot of us do shave and destroy the side growth of their beards, and not to gash their flesh for the dead, not to degrade their daughters or make them harlots, to venerate God's sanctuary. And I have here a picture on my wall that shows the sanctuary as it probably was in the time of the Exodus, and was built as a portable thing that could be carried along with them. And it says not to turn to ghosts or inquire of spirits. And I have a number of friends who are very interested in that. And I'm going to have to tell them that. And to rise before the aged and to show deference to the old. In the fourth reason, where the instruction is not to wrong the strangers who reside in the land, but to love them as oneself. And it's later recodified in the New Testament, as they say specifically, love thy neighbor as yourself. And then it says not to falsify weights or measures. In the fifth reading, the fifth Aliyah, God tells Moses of the penalties for transgression. And one to turn to ghosts or familiar spirits, the punishment would be that they would be cut off from their people. In the sixth reading, the sixth Aliyah, God told Moses to instruct the Israelites of more of the penalties for transgression. If you insult your mother or your father, you must be put to death. A man who committed adultery with a married woman would be put to death. And then it goes on, laying with your father's wife and the father's wife with whom you lay. If you lay with your daughter-in-law, you lay with a male as one lies with a woman. And obviously these have been rediscussed in recent times. One of the beautiful things that I love about Judaism is that it makes an effort to keep up with the times. So we have Orthodox Judaism, we have Flexidox, where they are somewhat flexible with these things. But one of the things that I don't think we have too many problems with right now is that you get put to death if you have carnal relations with a beast. Now, we used to have a dog. We never had carnal relations with that beagle, but we pet him and pet him and pet him, and he never got tired of it. That is not carnal relations. And if you're a woman and you actually approach any beast to mate with it, and the beast reacting as she approached, and that's something else. And one who had a ghost or a familiar spirit. You don't get put to death, but you just get cut off if you marry your sister. And if you lay with a woman in her infirmity, also. Or you could be dying childless. If you uncover the nakedness of your aunt. I mean, these seem to be so out of time and out of touch with the way Judaism is now. And I like that. And I think so. And I have a feeling that when our days are numbered and we hopefully go to heaven and we sit down with God, you know, the story about they go to heaven and they're standing in line, and this man in a doctor coat comes by, and we say, well, who's that? Someone says, oh, that's God. Sometimes he likes to play doctor. Well, there you go. There are 13 positive and 38 negative commandments in this portion. And some of this is elucidated in secular literature in George Eliot's Adam Bede, chapter 18. Never said a woman had need to be ugly and make a good missus of a house. And I told her she went clean again in the scriptures, for that says, love your neighbor as yourself, which comes back to this portion. But I said, if you love your neighbor no better or than you do yourself, Dinah, there's little enough you do for him. If you're thinking you might do well enough on a half-empty stomach. And then this goes on. The godson Arthur then comes in, and they really praise this guy to the stars. He says he outshone them as the planet Jupiter outshines the Milky Way, which is an interesting thing since Jupiter actually does outshine the Milky Way. And now we come to the Haftura. And I'd like to say a few words about the Haftura for Kadoshian. The Hafturas, were, according to a couple of sources here, the Hafturas were actually established in the time of Antiochus. Yes, that's Antiochus from Chronica. And he passed a regulation, Vladimir Antiochus. He outlawed public reading of the Torah. And instead of just defying that and reading the Torah anyway, the rabbis came up with a solution. What they would do is they established the custom of reading a topic from later on in the scripture that is similar to what was supposed to be read from the Torah. And the custom was so successful that even after the decree was nullified a few years later, this became part of the custom, and it still goes today. And there's also a little bit of specifically with the Haftura for Kadoshian, it seems we're being taught that whenever possible, we should try to avoid having some condemning passage read as part of the Haftura. Additionally, the content of Moses' Haftura from Amos has similar content to Kadoshian. And but this switch was not accepted. You know, it's amazing reading these things to see the detail in which the scholars, the rabbis, those who wrote up the Talmud, went into detail in every little aspect, and they didn't seem to leave out anything. And the Haftura was, at the time, was the one that I read so many years ago in 1961. And I'd like to end with some of the blessings. These blessings were started with the custom of the Torah. There are 5 of them. Certainly not going to go through all 5. But I want to remember the feeling of reading those things. As I was standing there, there's a great big shul, very, very large, a lot of people that day. And here I had my stupid little 12-year-old voice, because I was still only 12 when I had my bar mitzvah. I had this incredible feeling that I had, in a way, control of the synagogue. And what I didn't realize how much that was when I got to the end of each blessing, and I said in my little voice, Baruch atah Hashem, suddenly the entire choir behind me, in harmony, goes up. Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo. Anyway, there's just two parts of two blessings that I think that I'd like to repeat part of here. One of them is the blessing about the shield of David. And I think it was done at that time because there was the problem that there was kind of a similar to the anti-pope situation, where there were members of the family that did not come from the family of David. And so the prayer is that not to let others any longer inherit his glory. And it goes, Shelo yichpeh nevo leolam voed Baruch atah Hashem. And the congregation goes, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, Magen David. And then the choir was so good responding to my crazy little 12-year-old voice, it gave me the confidence. And when it came to the last blessing, I was really into it. And I did it slowly and loudly. And at the very end, it's the blessing to hallow the Sabbath. Yisborach Shimcha B'fi Kol Chai Tamid Le'olam Voed Baruch Atah Hashem. And then there's a second delay, and then the choir goes,
Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo. Right.
And then I finish it, Mechadesh, Shabbat. And that was the end of my bar mitzvah. It is something that I will never forget because I had so much fun doing it. But I really ignored it until this last week, when for the first time, I really went in to try to understand the meaning of what I was doing that day. And thank you very much. And back to you, Rabbi.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. Well, thank you, David, for sharing all that. And I just wanted to make a quick comment on the joke you mentioned briefly, because it brought to memory a joke that my dad used to tell that's a little bit of a variation on that. And I want to see if any of my contemporaries remember this particular variation, that the people are in heaven, okay? And all of a sudden, Frank Sinatra goes by. One person asks another, hey, was that Frank Sinatra? Oh no, that's God. He just thinks he's Frank Sinatra.
Yeah.
So and another thing is, it's sort of a, does anybody remember that version? Is that
Sure.
new to everybody? Or
Sure.
You do remember that? Okay.
Yeah, my version was from my sister.
Because I was a little kid, maybe I remember it wrong, but yeah. Yeah. And the other thing was about the use of auto, the use of auto Shem. Were you asked to say auto Shem during your service?
Oh, no.
It's kind of in my experience, that's used, and you're using when someone is singing making a liturgical performance, and there's a concern that, well, first of all, that it isn't really used during the time of the prayers, that also that something might happen to the record might get broken, whatever. So that it's only used when it's not actually a service. So I guess I'm trying to understand if during the actual service they had you say auto,
No.
and what that would have been for.
During the service, they had you say it the way it's supposed to be said.
Oh, you're just saying that now.
I'm just saying that now. However,
okay.
They also said, they brought up the custom during teaching, and they said, when you practice, say Adonai. because you're practicing and you don't want to mess it up when you're actually doing it.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, it didn't really hit me until about 2 weeks before the event when I finally started to get the hang of it. But I was very, very slow. I was pretty stupid back then as a kid. But I sure did enjoy that day.
Okay.
Maybe we're just not musically talented. I mean, my uncle told a story that that when he was learning his bar mitzvah, he tried to tell his bar mitzvah teacher that he didn't have an ear for music. So the bar mitzvah teacher sort of rolled up a tube and was singing it like directed in his ear, like like that would help, but it didn't. So yeah, it's just we're all wired differently, so.
Right.
Well, Steve, thank you for sharing.
Okay. Thank you, David. Thank you, Steve. So I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to tell my story with connected to the Torah portion and being on the Bima and whatever. And then I also have a few more comments that I want to add about Kadoshian specifically, but we'll do the more humorous part first. I had been studying Hebrew and I'd gone to Hebrew speaking camp and whatever. So the time of my bar mitzvah service, and hold that in abeyance because I have to put bar mitzvah in quotation marks, which was the night before David's. So he was in the morning and I was on the Friday night, in different locations. But that was not my first time reading Torah in front of the congregation. I had already done it three or four times on either on Shabbat or even on, I forget if it was Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, in front of the whole congregation. I had done that the year before. Anyway, the rabbi with whom I grew up, who was my mentor, Philip Horowitz of blessed memory, was a real Hebrew scholar, as those of you who have been in class with me might have heard. And he was what we call a midakdik. He was very, very specific in Hebrew grammar, and he would test me on it all the time and whatever. But not only in the grammar, but also in translation. English was his second language, maybe even his third language. He was born in Vienna. So he was very, very exact, not only with grammar, but also with translation, which I inherited a lot. Those of you who have studied with me know that's a focus of mine. And he did not like, as a Reform rabbi, even though he had more traditional background, he did not like the term bar mitzvah. He didn't like it because it was specifically and only it was a masculine term. Okay, and he believed in total equality in the ritual and in the services between men and women. And you couldn't say bar mitzvah, which is actually a combination of Aramaic. Bar is the Hebrew word for son. I'm sorry, bar is the Aramaic word for son. Mitzvah is, of course, the Hebrew word. And if you tried to change that into the feminine form, it would come out as Barat, B-R-A-T, Barat mitzvah. And he felt that was, maybe he consulted his three daughters and his wife and his very strong mother about that. And they said, no, you can't have a brat mitzvah. That doesn't, that won't make sense in English. So he did some research and whatever, looking in the sources, and he found the term ben Torah, which also then could be feminized as bat Torah, but all in Hebrew, the son or daughter of Torah. So we were in a congregation that he founded, and I was only about the third or fourth ben Torah in the congregation. The congregation was maybe 2 years old at that point in 1961. We did not have a building. Our high holiday services were held in the auditorium of a junior high school, a middle school, and our Friday night and Saturday morning services, when we did have them, were in a Unitarian church. This is in one of the suburbs of Cleveland. So the term was new, the congregation was new, and my parents didn't really proofread the invitations to my service that well. So the invitations went out, inviting everyone to come to the Friday night service at Congregation Brith Emeth, which didn't have the word temple, didn't have the word synagogue in it, where Norman will become a Ben Torah. People hardly had ever heard that term before. First Unitarian Church on Shaker Boulevard in Shaker Heights, Ohio, whatever it was. And we started getting phone calls. Aren't you Jewish? Why are you having a Unitarian service, something like that? Isn't it a bar mitzvah? What? And it's a story that, like with David's but the 2 weeks before the service were filled with all of the chaos of people having to explain to people what was really going on. And all that. And like I said, it wasn't as climactic for me because I had already read from the Torah and helped lead services. My rabbi had already picked me out and said, "I'm going to make you a rabbi," whatever. And sadly, it could have been sad. It wasn't. One of the most momentous memories is that a next door neighbor had a heart attack during the service, and so we had to stop the service, and the paramedics came in and wheeled him out and during the service. So that's what a lot of people remember. Anyway, so that's my service of becoming bar mitzvah or ben Torah, whatever it is. But I want to add three. Yes, Steve, quickly. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. It's my own story, but it's
all right. Let me do my other comments.
I'll do it later. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do some other comments that will come back to you. So three things that I wanted to add on with David's presentation in reverse order. Haftura. Many people call it mistakenly Haftorah or even Haftorah. The two words have nothing. Torah and Haftarah have nothing to do with each other. In Hebrew, they're spelled differently. It's not like part of the Torah or whatever. Haftarah literally means like a supplement, okay, something to add on to. And then, as David was saying correctly, the thinking is that the rabbis suggested that we read the Haftarah, the supplemental reading, which will remind us of the Torah portion when we were forbidden from reading that. But people mistakenly say Haftorah, and it's not. It's Haftarah. It's with a tet instead of a taf. That's number one. Number two is. And we won't take a lot of time now. We'll wait for when the Saturday morning group gets to Leviticus 19, which may be in a year or two. I'm not really sure, but so the opening statement, and as David reminded us, is you shall Kadoshian tihiyu, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And that's the typical translation, but just as valid and certainly open to a lot more discussion, commentary, interpretation is not you shall be holy, but either you are holy, you're already holy, you were born, all human beings are holy, whatever, or you can be holy. Kadoshim tihiyu. You have the ability to be holy in your lives. It's not automatic. It's not a gift that was implanted within you. Pardon me, I have a sneeze coming, but so that's really open to a lot of discussion. What is the import, and then followed by all of these examples of things that we can do to be holy, to strive to be holy, to demonstrate the innate holiness that we have. Is a very interesting commentary and session that we can have. Similarly, near the end I think it's the second Aliyah, and David referred to it. And this is actually the phrase that is in the exact middle of the Torah. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that also leads into a lot of conversation. How many people don't really love themselves? How many people don't really have a sense of self-worth, self-confidence, and whatever that? But the mitzvah, if you will, the commandment from God, if you look at the statement and translation, is you have to love yourself first before you love your neighbor. Okay, if you really want to understand what that is, love your neighbor as you love yourself. You can't love your neighbor until you love yourself. What is that? Is exactly is God through Moses? What exactly are they telling us or challenging us? So it's a very, very rich section of the Torah. Coincidentally, it's right in the middle of the Torah. Hillel, of course, says it's the most important part of the Torah. Start from there, Zil Gamar, then go out and study all the rest, because all the rest of it is commentary upon that one statement of Kadoshian Tihiyu. Okay, Steve, you wanted to tell your story?
Oh, yeah. Kind of a little bit of yichus. I can show off a little bit here, but apropos the topic of the evolution of egalitarian bat mitzvah, bar mitzvah, my maternal grandfather was assistant when he came over from Europe. He became the assistant to Mordecai Kaplan, who founded the Reconstructionist movement.
Right.
The family actually lived at the Society for the Advancement
of Judaism, right,
which was just across from Park Avenue, Central Park in New York City. And there was like a top story apartment where he lived, and he was like the bar mitzvah instructor and sort of assistant to Mordecai Kaplan. He never qualified as a rabbi, but he was very educated. He spent some time in the University of Vienna before he came over to the US. And my mom was one of the first Benot Mitzvah, because the Reconstructionist movement also initiated a bot.
Well, that right. And Kaplan's daughter was the first.
Exactly. Yes. Kaplan's daughter was first, and that my mom always told me, and she was among the first, and I still have some books that she was given on her, bat mitzvah that have dedications in Hebrew. Kind of cool. I don't know if my mother was able to read them, but yeah, but I can. It's kind of cool.
That's good yichus. The legend, I don't know, and maybe your family can verify it, but the legend that they tell is that Mordecai Kaplan was teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary, at the conservative rabbinic school at the time, when his daughter Judith came to him when she was 11, 12 years old, whatever, and said, Abba, Father, why can't I have some kind of a service that denotes my adulthood in the Jewish community? And he said, my daughter, no, I've never been asked that question. Let me do some research. And he did some research and found, that again, according to halakha, a woman can teach and can read some of these things. It just doesn't. You're allowed to. It's just that certain times, especially related to their period and whatever, they can't be touching the Torah scroll. They can't be, and there are issues about whether men can be hearing the voice of a woman and whatever. But as far as actually having a ceremony and a ritual where the woman's adulthood in Jewish life is confirmed, is recognized, there was nothing against that. So Kaplan went to the dean and the administration of the rabbinic school, JTS, and said, I'd like to book the chapel for a service in which my daughter will be able to read the Torah. She won't read from the scroll, she'll read from a book, and he'll do all those things. And he presented the halachic reasoning behind it. and the administration voted and said, no, you can't do that's, chas v'chalila, that we have a woman leading the service. And he said, well, if you're not going to let me do it, I'm going to go and start my own movement, my own place. And now that may be legend and urban myth, but it goes hand in hand with not only with Judith Eisenstein Kaplan, because she wound up marrying one of Kaplan's prize students, but not going along with the time of her becoming bat mitzvah. I think it was 1927, I think, and but also then the founding of the Reconstructionist, or the development of the Reconstructionist movement, that was non-synagogue slash sanctuary oriented. So, okay, great. Okay, the third parsha that we talk about today is, for this week, it's Emor, which means say. So God says to Moses, say to the people. And yes, there are commentators that jump in and say, well, why is this one say as opposed to speak or command and whatever? But we're not going to spend our time on that. Going back to, it's almost like the Kadoshian piece that we've just been talking about. The holiness code was kind of placed in the middle between the end of Acharemot, talking about the priest and Aaron and his sons and what they wear and what they do and what they don't do, and what's different and what's unique about them, as opposed to in Kadoshim, things that all the people should do and not just the priests. But it begins with the kedusha, the sanctity, or, as I was mentioning before, the tabooness, if I can say it that way, of the priests, and what if they automatically, by virtue of being born to a priest, following the male line, but what they might do intentionally, unintentionally, that would cause them to lose the status of kedusha, of holiness and sanctity, as a priest. And one of the things that's specifically listed here is that the priest, and we already encountered the priest, and I mentioned a little bit quickly before, the priest serving as a healer and serving as the one who would determine whether a particular infection was contagious, whether the person who had a fungus or some kind of a growth or some kind of a discharge, whether he or she had to be sent out from the camp and quarantined. That was the priest's role. They didn't have MDs or DOs at the time. But the priest was trying to maintain not only the sense of kedusha, of holiness, but also of being tahor. Tahor is translated as pure, clean and pure, or tameh, which is impure, or unclean. And one of the things that would make the priest unclean, or tameh, meaning ineligible to offer sacrifices or to accept offerings from the people, one of the things that they were prohibited from doing was not to touch a carcass, not to touch a dead body, a corpse, in any way, except for certain relatives. So the priest had to avoid, and that is now expanded. Some of you might know, it might be in your family, that somebody from the priestly class, a Kohen and whatever, won't go into the funeral home, for example. They'll stay outside or in a different room of the funeral home during a cemetery. Won't go into the particular area of the grave, but will stay out by the roadway or by the driveway to make sure that there's no inadvertent touching of a corpse and whatever. It starts back from this particular commandment, that except that the priest is allowed a matter of fact, it's more than allowed. It's actually because of what David was talking about, respect for mother and father, right? Honor your father and your mother. So the priest certainly does defile himself. Again, only himself, no herself. Himself for mother, father. This is upon if there's a death, God forbid, the death of a mother, father, children, brother, sister, only if she is not married. Once she's been married, in biblical terms, then she's no longer in his family. Therefore, he does not defile himself. He does not become tameh by being in the same room or whatever with her body. It's only later on that the rabbis, the sages, add wife to that list. In the original list in the Torah, the wife is not included. It's interesting. Mother was a female, a daughter would be, and a non-married sister would be, but not the wife. So there's extra commentary about that. And then, as was mentioned earlier, the priest specifically is not to shave his head, not to shave the sides of your beards. A little bit later on, those practices are specifically assigned to one who volunteer, not only to the priest, the Kohen, but also to one who voluntarily this could be male or female, though obviously not with the shaving, but one who takes the oath of being a Nazir, a Nazarite, one who takes that kind of a vow, and that gets us into the Haftura portion of Samson and all those stories. Okay, a priest, member of the priestly class, cannot marry a divorced woman, although there were many occasions when the priest did, but then he no longer can serve as a priest. Also, no individual male of the priestly class with any kind of physical impairment, birth defect, blindness, deafness, whatever it might be, could not serve as a priest in the ritual, in the sacrificial cult. If there was any kind of a skin disease or any kind of an eruption or a puncture in the skin that would ooze, I don't know the exact Hebrew word offhand for ooze, but that's what they meant. There were restrictions and ways to be cleansed, become tahor again, to become pure again after that happened, but it was not a permanent. It was not a permanent prohibition from serving as a priest. Okay. Then also within the category of what the priest would do, there's an important statement that offerings that were brought to the priest, whether it be an animal, whether it be grain, produce, whatever, offerings that were brought to the priest are to be accepted unquestionably, whether it's by an Israelite or by a non-Israelite, by what they call a ger, a stranger, someone who lives within your gates, but is not necessarily one who is converting. But and also they're not to the priest is not to not only should accept every offering, but also not to question the purpose behind. If someone, an Israelite or a stranger, comes and says, I bring you this as a guilt offering, as a sin offering, whatever it might be, please offer it on my behalf. The priest is not supposed to say, and tell me what you did. Why do you think you need to offer a sin? That was not, it's to be accepted unquestionably. They then move on, and the more well-known section of the portion of Emor talks about the holiday calendar, the festival calendar, with some details about some of the festivals that we have not yet encountered, or they're put into specific context. They're called Mo'adei Adonai, usually translated as sacred times for God, but the word Mo'ed has within it the word that means testify or testimony or serving as a witness. So it's usually associated as a holiday or a festival, but it's a time of testifying. It's a time of witnessing your participation within the community. Obviously, the first festival, if you will, or holy day that's mentioned, because it's always the most important one, and the most frequent one is the Shabbat, every seventh day. Then they start the festival calendar year beginning in the springtime, beginning now, because the first month is the spring month. Okay, the month of it's known as the month of Aviv in the Torah. We now call it the month of Nisan. So the first festival that's celebrated is Passover, is Pesach, which is observed in the Torah, observed for 7 days, with the first day and the last day being considered Mikra'e Kodesh, being considered days of special holiness and special announcement, if you will, and communal participation. Then 7 weeks after the first day of Pesach, which means a total of 50 days, comes the festival of Shavuot, although it's more frequently referred to as the Chag HaBikurim in the Torah. It's the first fruits. It's the spring harvest, if you will. That's on the 50th day. And Steve, I don't know, were you ever in Israel and went to a Bikurim celebration on a kibbutz or something, where all the children would still walk in? I mean, they don't associate it with receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai the way that contemporary diaspora Jews do, whatever, or traditional Jews. But on the kibbutzim, they used to still bring first fruits, and that would be the celebration at Shavuot.
Yeah,
you ever participate in that?
I did spend some time on a kibbutz. I don't remember clearly if they had anything like that. It was on this, which was a non-religious kibbutz. It
right,
was,
right.
associated with the Noah Oved movement, like labor.
Right.
But
I was taken to see one.
But I do remember my baby brother. I do remember my baby brother who was in kindergarten. Now he's not a baby anymore, obviously, but then he was in kindergarten. In kindergarten, they celebrated all these things non-religiously, because he's a non-religious. Everything in Israel, of course, is designated either religious or secular, and so he was in a secular kindergarten, but they still celebrated it and had songs and, Bikurim, and they did the whole little dance, kindergarten version of the celebration of the first fruits and all that.
Right. So in the Torah
it was a
portion,
kindergarten thing.
There's no connection to Shavuot being an anniversary of receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai. Okay, that certainly comes much later. But again, in talking about Shavuot and talking about the harvest, they repeat what David had mentioned earlier within the context of Kadoshian. When you're doing your harvesting, leave the edges of the field, leave the corners of the field, and the gleanings of that which is left from the harvest for the poor and for the stranger and for the widow and for the orphan. Then we jump in the festival calendar to what's called Yom Teruah. Remember Teruah from the shofar sound, one of the shofar sound, but it's not known as Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. We call it that, but it's the first of the 7th month. The number 7 obviously appearing very, 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 very regularly in the Torah and all of the calendar connections. So Yom Teruah is what we call Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the seventh month. Then 10 days later is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the day of self-denial and fasting. Shabbat Shabbaton, it's the Sabbath of Sabbaths. Yom Kippur is considered a Sabbath. It's the only other day other than the seventh day that's considered a Sabbath. And then on the 15th day of that month, we begin the festival of Sukkot, booths or tabernacles. The etrog and the lulav, the fruit of the hadar tree and the myrtle and the willow, that's all specifically described and commanded. Technically, according to the Torah, you're only supposed to carry your lulav and your etrog on the first day. Again, the rabbis later on said, no, you have to have it with you for the entire 7-8 days of Sukkot. Everyone is supposed to dwell in a shelter, in a temporary shelter of some sort to represent the sukkah that the Israelites dwelled in when they left Egypt. You're supposed to then it goes on. Um, that all the children of Israel, in order to make sure that these Moadei Adonai, that these special appointed times can be celebrated correctly, the children of Israel are commanded to collect and bring to the priests shemen zait zach. That's the oil from beaten olives. Okay, that had to be used to keep all of the lights maintained, not only the Ner Tamid, not only the symbol of God's presence, but all of the lights had to be all of the candles and all, not candles, but all of the lights, both to illuminate as well as to refer to God's presence, or even for the altar, the fire on the altar. Everyone was supposed to participate in collecting and bringing the olives, and then beating the olives to be able to get the pure oil. Everyone was supposed to bring loaves of bread, or more likely like pita, frankincense, and that was the special meal that the priests would eat above and beyond the whatever was brought to them from the gleanings of the field and the harvests. Then there's a final little interlude that again it leads into a lot of different commentary and discussion. There's an argument, or an argument occurred between an Israelite man and another man whose mother was an Israelite, but the father was Egyptian. Okay. So that obviously leads into some questioning of, so this second man, not the first man, but the second man, it says his mother was Israelite, the father was Egyptian. So does that mean that he was considered a member of the, MOT? Was he a member of the tribes, or was he a ger? Was he a stranger? Because in those days, the identity followed the father, not the mother. So if the father was an Egyptian, the mother was an Israelite. Some say that he was still welcome in the community, but he didn't have a tribal affiliation. So that leads into a lot of discussion in later rabbinic literature. And as you know, then the tradition defined you're Jewish if the mother was Jewish, matrilineal, even though the Torah seemed to imply that it was patrilineal, that it followed the father. But in their discussions and their debate and the Talmudic resolutions from this little interlude is why they clarified that we better say, since we no longer have all of the tribes anyway, we'd better maintain the statement that you're Jewish if the mother The mother was Jewish. Anyway, the second man, who there's debate as to whether or not he was considered an Israelite, uttered some kind of sentence or whatever, and that defamed. It was blasphemous. It defamed God's name. And then Moses came up. The issue was brought to Moses, and Moses. Again, there's lots of commentary and interpretation about it, because if he's not a member of the community, then he can't be subject to the same restrictions about using God's name in vain if he's not a member of the community. But if he is an Israelite and he blasphemed God's name, then he should be stoned. He should be put to death. So the commentators go back and forth as to how it is. Moses's answer is that he should be stoned to death. He should have known better, so to speak. And then they get into a conversation about capital punishment, with the familiar phrase that we have seen before back in Exodus of an eye for a tooth, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, life for a life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and exactly clarifying what that means, as opposed to attacking or creating harm or even killing a human being, as opposed to an animal or a slave later on. That because for those the punishment is to make restitution, but for eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the question is, was it a life for a life? Was it indeed capital punishment? Or is it, as understood, is that the value of an eye, the value of a tooth, the value of a hand, or whatever it might be? And ultimately, the bottom line for all of this, at the end of the parsha, the end of the chapter, is that there shall be one law for Israelite and the stranger. For whatever reason, and we can speculate, we can debate, for whatever reason, ultimately Moses' decision is that Israelite and stranger living within our community have to be treated alike in matters of law and justice, and crime and punishment, torts and damages, whatever it might be. So there's the summary. If we had more time, we would talk a little bit more about the lex talionis, about the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and also about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In the text, I didn't mention it in the summary, but I was going to if we put a lot more time into it. The key word for in the Hebrew, when it describes in this listing of the holidays, like I said, of the festival calendar, is after talking about Passover, after talking about Shavuot, after talking about Rosh Hashanah, the conjunctive word, the Hebrew word, is ach. Okay? Ach, bayom ha'esor, but, or albeit, or howbeit. There's a difference between what we've said about the previous festivals and the one that's coming up. Okay? There's a distinction. Yom Kippur is considered totally different than the other festivals. And that's why it can be called a Shabbaton. That's kind of why it can be called the Sabbath of Sabbaths. The day of rest is a totally different type of day, and adding in the self-denial and the fasting, and all of those other kinds of questions. So if you're ever in a conversation with someone speaking Hebrew and they say but, it adds this extra little condition to understanding what I'm about to say. So with that, if there are any particular questions or comments that somebody wants to throw out, otherwise I'll turn it over to Ruth Ann as hostess. And do we have anything that Jean wants to ask or say something, or just raise her hand for exercise?
The whole thing about defying oneself.
For the priest defiling himself?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You can't, wife was excluded, but also daughter or sister was excluded if that sister is married.
Yeah, actually, they don't phrase it
Um,
as married. They actually phrase it as if she's a virgin. But the understanding is that if she loses her virginity, it's because she's married. So they
mhm.
understand the way they defined it is if she's unmarried, as opposed to saying if she's still a virgin.
Well, if you what this means is that a woman who has no children is the worst of the worst. Because a woman who has children, then that category would be mother, and a married woman. Anyway, I guess I was looking at what all these things are, because you can be a woman who is both a mother and a sister and a daughter and all of that, but a married woman who has no children is it's like nobody can touch her.
Um, well, a woman, whether she's married or not, would not have been in the role of a priest.
Right. But
Right,
the priest could not.
to be
The priest
defied.
could not touch.
Right. So they
The priest could not touch.
right. They use this list when someone says, and I get the question. Sadly, I get the question frequently. Just had it like 10 days ago. My relationship to so and so is such and such. Am I do I say Kaddish for that person? Am I considered a mourner? Do I wear a ribbon? And the rabbis through history have derived exactly who's a mourner based on this list of who's considered. That's what they consider like first degree relatives, kind of thing. Okay, so grandchild is not. I remember having when our teenage son died. I remember having the conversation with my in-laws. Okay, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law said, what are we considered? And I said, well, according to biblical law, because it just didn't happen that way. So, please, David.
Yeah, I think I wanted to to wish you a long life. I had not heard until now about the loss of your teenage son. But well, the thing that I wanted to say was you shared with us the fact that your synagogue at the time of your bar mitzvah was just starting, and you had the real holy honor of being a part of the founding of the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, the Shar Shemaim was well established by then, but my grandfather was a prominent member of the committee that designed and built that synagogue. And I've never forgotten that, and that he was there on that day.
So my similar story, and then we'll close it. When we moved to Cleveland, my parents had met and married in Cleveland. Then they moved to New York. We were in New York, where I was born, and moved back to Cleveland. So my father's family had been associated with one of the two main congregations in Cleveland that dated back to the 1870s, 1880s. I'm not sure how far back Montreal Shar Shemaim went, but Anshe Chesed, which was then known as Euclid Avenue Temple in Cleveland, went back to the 1880s, or late 1870s, 1880s, whatever. And in the 1930s, my uncle, one of my father's younger brothers, was the cantor of that temple. He was then killed in Normandy, World War II. I was born a few years later. I was named after him. Right. In 1957, Anshe Chesed congregation built a new synagogue out in the suburbs. And at the dedication service, the Friday night service of dedicating that new sanctuary, then in 1957, this Norman Roman sang the cantorial parts for that congregation, that my uncle had been the cantor for 25 years, whatever, before that. So some of us do have those kind of
Yeah.
legacy